Welcome to the Spiderforest Webcomic Podcast. I'm Mathieu Moyen. In this episode, say it like you mean it. Few things add more depth to a story than an artificial language. If you want proof, start with The Lord of the Rings and work your way outward. But languages take thousands of years to evolve. How do you go about making your own in less than a lifetime? And more than that, how do you make it believable? Well, in this episode, we're going to tackle this head on. First up, I have an interview with Jim Francis, the creator of the comic Outsider. We'll be talking about language, aliens, science fiction, and building a believable alien culture with language to match. Then, Eva, the creator of the comic Bits Fair, will be back with some of our members who've done the same. Julia Francis of the comic Chronicles of Oro will be with us, along with G Pike of the comic title Unrelated. Language, meaning, and culture is the topic for this episode, so stay with us. Hi, I'm Mathieu Moyen, and I'm the creator of the science fiction webcomic Six Commando. Back when I was starting out, I looked to a number of other creators' work to try to find inspiration for the kind of story that I was trying to write. And one of the first was the epic space opera Outsider, which is written and drawn by veteran artist Jim Francis. The enormous amount of detail he puts into the background and world building of Outsider is something that I've always had a tremendous amount of respect for. And we sat down recently to talk about his high level of commitment to realism and research in writing what is essentially a space fantasy.
Part of it is because that's what I really enjoy about writing and creating a story. One of the reasons I like fantastical or science fiction or fantasy settings is that you can really create a setting as opposed to having to stick to, say, a historical setting or a real world setting. And that's really a lot of what I enjoy about storytelling. The other factor to Outsider specifically is that because it's been a very long-term project, I've had a lot of time to do perhaps more world building than is strictly necessary for the story. So we see some of that as well.
Tell me where you started with that. I know that you've drawn a lot of influence and a lot of inspiration from a variety of different sources. I mean, some of it is, I wouldn't say send-ups, but interesting takes on common tropes from anime and science fiction. But you've really put a very unique spin on it.
Well, I grew up loving everything to do with science fiction and space, and I was a huge fan as a kid of the early anime series that were available in the United States, even though I wasn't aware at the time that they were Japanese. And they were just both from a sort of high adventure space opera standpoint and from a visual, especially, standpoint. That was something that really engaged me as a budding artist and a budding writer. So themes that I really enjoyed, they're like blue-skinned aliens and, cool looking starships blowing each other up. Those were things that I wanted to deal with in one way or another. And I tried to put my own spin on it. Hopefully I was successful.
Well, I definitely think that you were. I mean, for those who aren't completely familiar with your comic, it's essentially human beings are not the central characters of the comic. They're not the central actors. They are, in a sense, secondary to an interaction that's happening between the sort of elf-like Loroi and the insectoid Umiak, and the humans, therefore, sort of are viewing this from the outside. I don't know if that has anything to do with the title, but it's certainly the way that the story reads is very much, there's one central human character who you identify very heavily with, who is viewing this with incomplete knowledge of what's going on.
The titular outsider refers first and foremost to the main character, the point of view character Alex, who's really the only human that we see a great deal of in the story. And it's very much a sort of Gulliver's Travels or James Clavell's Shogun type of situation where humanity is there as a viewpoint. We don't delve too deeply into how humanity has changed. It's mostly a human viewpoint of these alien actors. And Alex is important in the story. He's not just there to gawk at stuff that's going on around him. He has to try to find a way to establish some mechanism for humanity to survive this horrific conflict. But in terms of the world building and the cultures that he has to learn to navigate are the alien cultures, not the human one.
One of the big parts of the background is that the aliens speak very much as aliens, and they think like aliens. So there's a thought process even in the ones who are humanoid, who are sort of ostensibly relatable as humans, they don't really think the same way. And that is one of the sort of the immediate turns that happens in the characterization of it, I think. The Loroi, who are sort of elf-like, blue-skinned aliens, you sort of turn that trope on its head in that, in the traditional sense, that making somebody look human is a way of wanting to make them attractive to the person who is viewing them. And they may not necessarily be the kind of characters who you would really want to be interacting with.
There's a couple things going on there. First of all, I think just from an interesting storytelling point of view, I mean, the reason I have blue and humanoid aliens there is because I thought it would be cool. And as a story got built, I mean, we have the two warring factions here. One is humanoid and fairly relatable, even though they're alien. The other one is extremely alien and not terribly relatable at all. And so it would be difficult, especially in a medium like comics, to have the reverse situation where Alex was with the Umiak, the insectoid Umiak, and trying to learn their culture. That would be a stretch for human readers. But the fun of developing backstories and, developing the idea of an alien culture is to consider the ways in which the Leroy might be different from humans. And so every time there's a question that we ask about how do Leroy do something, I try to think of an answer that's maybe a little different from the way that humans would do things. And I think that can pay off a lot in the story as well. There's plenty of character moments between Alex and the Leroy where the things that they do don't always make sense to him, even though they're supposed to be very similar to humans.
What about the languages? One of the aspects of it that a lot of people I know have found very interesting is that both of the alien species have a developed language. You essentially constructed artificial languages for them to speak. And in the case of the Leroy, you developed a whole lexicon and an alphabet. And I think you developed an alphabet for the Umiak as well, in that they sort of have a shortened cuneiform style alphabet. I mean, it's so completely developed, so fully developed. That's a really, I don't, like, where do you start with that? I mean, to have gone that far with it is such a level of commitment to that story that I find it fascinating.
Yeah, and that's a case where I may have gone farther than is strictly necessary. But I mean, I love the Lord of the Rings books. But one of the things that really blew me away was, and this was quite some time ago, but now I think it's common knowledge and it's all over in the internet. You can ask it, but I got a book that was it was a dictionary of the various languages used in Lord of the Rings. And so I was really blown away to read this and realize that every word that he had used meant something. And I was like, wow. And so I've always had a secret desire to do stuff like that. But where that started was really there wasn't going to be a lot of use of the trade language other than in the introduction to show that they were speaking a different language. And then I would switch over to English, as the narrator is translating this for the reader. And this is another one of those things where a lot of spare time just got dumped into overtime adding to that lexicon. And so it's a bit more of the part of the story now in terms of names that get used, even though they don't speak trade directly very often. But it's another aspect that helps add to the sense that this is a real setting as opposed to something that was just made up.
Where did you start tackling a task like that? I mean, it's English, for example, definitely not the simplest human language, but it's one that developed over hundreds of years as dozens of different languages collided with each other. I mean, where do you start with the task of producing your own language in a way that's going to make it seem like it's had those sorts of influences on it?
Making it seem like it's developed as a real language is tough, and that's a life's work. I mean, Tolkien spent his entire life developing these languages, and really the stories came about as a secondary thing to put them to use. When I'm developing languages for a story, I usually start with coming up with a set of names, which kind of serves as a foundation for how that language sounds. And I try to emphasize that there are certain sounds that they use and certain sounds that they don't use. In cases like with the Umiak, they have a very limited range of sounds. So that's much more straightforward to say, okay, they can make these clicking and ticking sounds, and that's basically all they can do. Whereas in a language like the Leroy, I just came up with some names that I thought sounded good to me and realized that there was no Ks and there were some other sounds that were missing. And so I sort of started making up more words that followed those rules. And then when I realized that I was going to have him speak, dialogue, and I would need a lot more, basically I would need some kind of a lexicon. I created a program that would generate random words based on phonemes that followed the rules of the language, and just generate a very long list and then pick out words that made sense. I was helped there in that, and I initially wrote those programs myself. And then I found there was a publicly available program called LangMaker that would basically do it for you in a spreadsheet format. And so that helped me a lot. Unfortunately, that's no longer available. So if I were going to do more, I would have to, again, write it myself. But So what I have is I have this very large Excel spreadsheet with an English lexicon and then randomly generated words for each word. And then I have to go through and manually change and alter them so that similar meaning words may have similar trade word roots. And that's the process of making it seem more like a real language as opposed to a randomly generated one.
What about grammatical issues are another level. That's a whole other layer that gets added into it.
If you're going to build a language, it obviously helps to know something about how languages are constructed. And I'm not by any means a language expert, but I have studied Latin and Russian and Japanese. So I do have some knowledge of how some potentially very different language systems could work. And trade uses some language structures from Japanese, actually, in addition to some from English. So if you have real-world language examples, it's easy to just crib grammar elements or constructions or word order elements from existing languages, because we have an awful lot of different languages that work very differently.
Do you feel like your characters think in their languages, or do they think in English and you're in a sort of a constant process of translating?
In the case of the Leroy, trade language is kind of an unusual case, and this is one place where I can get away with having a relatively simple language that doesn't have all of these complex forms, because really, to the Leroy who communicate telepathically, spoken language is an artificial thing to them. And so it's mostly used in an official capacity. So they don't have a lot of slang, they don't have a lot of idiom. And when they think, they don't think in language, they think and communicate telepathically, which is a different way of communicating. They don't just telepathically send words. It's a different way of doing things altogether. So to them, when Leroy speak, unless they're someone like Tempo, whose job is to speak, they tend to speak sort of disjointedly or not really clearly. In the case of one of the ideas that I had for the Umiak speech was, in their case, the way they talk did affect their character and how they think, because if you have a repetitive staccato language like that, where there's only a few different sounds and very, very many different combinations of those sounds, then your ability to remember that is going to become an important element. And so I don't remember where I'd heard it, but someone had suggested the concept of a stack to a language, which is the sentence structure includes keywords where you push or pop words or concepts onto and off of a stack. And this kind of allows you to talk out of order. And this is something that I thought would both make the Umiak feel particularly alien, but would also help advance the idea that they're incredibly detail-focused and very, very good at doing math in their heads and all kinds of really heavy-duty technical or scientific things that would make them a very formidable opponent in that sense.
So when you write your characters, you feel like how do you get into that kind of headspace in order to write that dialogue then?
Once again, it's always trying to say, you're writing and you write a line of dialogue and then you ask yourself, okay, here's the natural way a human would say it. How would a Leroy go about saying the same thing, keeping in mind the idea that she's kind of translating, even though she's technically speaking in her own language, she's really translating a thought, and in what different ways can you try to make that sound? And sometimes I think I've been more successful than others at that. In the case of the Umiak, that was, I'd had the idea for the language for a long time, but I only actually worked out the details of it right before I had to write the pages in which the first Umiak character speaks. And I really hadn't thought through how he would sound with it translated. It was really a delightful thing to do, because the way he speaks in the comic is in these sort of rambling, half-sensible sentences with these emphasized sections, which would represent the stack construct. And it really came together in a very short period of time, and I was just delighted with how it worked out. But it really kind of, I would have to take a walk or go away to stop thinking that way. It was very strange, because you have to have a slightly different headspace to speak forwards and backwards and in an alien fashion. It was really quite interesting.
One of the things that it reminded me of actually is it was one of the one-off aliens of the week that they produced for Star Trek at one point, called the Shellyak. And they remind me very much of that. It has that sort of thing, because it was a non-human alien they was sort of, obviously it was this sort of one of these art thriving on restrictions things, where it was this low budget thing where it was this kind of amorphous mass that somebody was inside there sort of pumping it out and then making it look like it was breathing, but it was just sort of this massive stuff, and they had to come up with a language for it and a way that it was thinking as a result.
Yeah, they did. They had some interesting ideas for how an alien language might be sort of incomprehensible, even if you understood the words. They did that with Darmok and Jalad or whatever that was. Sometimes I don't think they took those ideas far enough. Like I think the Sheliak, they would have an alien that's supposed to be incomprehensible, and yet they would say things that were very sort of colloquial occasionally. And you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, they had lots of great ideas in Star Trek in terms of how aliens could be different, and often in ways more than just how they look, because most of their aliens look like humans with ridges on their noses.
Well, in that way, your work reminds me sort of more of Stanislav Lem, who spent his entire career exploring the idea of aliens who could be so alien that they would be beyond human understanding. And that's it's very hard to have conflict in a story when the two characters, not only are they just totally at loggerheads, but can't even understand each other, can't even have any level of comprehension, because in order for there to be a conflict, even then there has to be some sort of an understanding between the two creatures, the two races.
Right. And in an adventure story like Outsider, there's a practical limit to how far you can sometimes take some of these concepts, like, a truly alien species, or getting too heavily into how the aliens think, because it just doesn't read either in that story type or in, a visual medium like comics. But other kinds of stories, you certainly can go that far. And the chief conflict itself is that the two sides don't really understand each other.
You have a really well-developed visual style as well that extends to the way that the ships are designed, the fact that you've worked out things like how far, at what distances the ships are engaging each other, how big the universe is relative to your perception of it on the page. It's one of the things that's so well developed about it that definitely I think is one of the reasons that people find it so continuously engaging.
Well, it's about the things that I geek out over, which, I'm also, in addition to loving science fiction and fantasy and animation, I'm also a huge gamer, both strategy games and other types of games. And so and also I'm a sort of a student of military history. If one is going to write a story about a war, I think it's very important that someone understands how that war works. One of the things that I find not as satisfying as it could be about Star Trek at times, particularly when they're dealing with war, is that they don't really seem to have a clear strategic view of how the war works. Towards the end of Deep Space Nine, where there was these large-scale military actions going on, they didn't really make a lot of sense. In Star Trek, you have warp drive, and so basically, if you wanted to, you could fly directly to the opponent's homeworld and just have your battle there, as opposed to having to fight in intermediate systems. And they never really thought that through. There are a couple of ground battles depicted in that war, and yet even the tiniest of these starships has the ability to completely destroy a planet. And so that doesn't make sense either. So if you're going to tell a story about war in which the fighting is more than just a backdrop, it's part of the story, then I think you need to work out how all that works. And of course, for me, that sometimes can get into far more detail than is actually necessary for the story elements. It's because that's what I enjoy thinking about. You need to know how far ships can travel and what their endurance is and what the weapons ranges are if you're going to construct any kind of credible space battle.
So it's all there in the manual. To quote a trope, you have to write the manual first before you can know how to apply it.
Right, and so I'm excited that now that I actually have some of that stuff on the comic page instead of just in the notes, it does make it feel a lot more real when you actually can see it happen, as opposed to it just being a treatise on how it should work.
It's actually funny that you mentioned that. Six Commando is very much the same way, in that I have been very slowly amassing this sort of manual of hardware and tactics and politics and all of the stuff that goes along with it, which some people tend to like more than the comic. That may be a world-building pitfall, actually, because it's such an interesting intellectual exercise to build universes, to design starships, in my case, to build tanks of various kinds, and to design political systems. You can forget to put a story around it.
If you're into that sort of thing, then world building can become a real distraction, sometimes leading to both spending more time on unnecessary world building than on actually telling the story sometimes. And also, you have to resist the temptation to try to shoehorn all this stuff into the story. So I go whole hog when I'm developing the backstory, but I don't necessarily feel the need to try to squeeze everything that I've created somewhere into the narrative. But for a while, when the comic didn't have very many pages, but had a substantial amount of background information, people were giving me some grief that there was more information in the backstory than there was in the actual story. So A, it was nice to get some of that on the page, but B, it really feels different when you finally get it in the story. It feels less theoretical. It feels like it's almost real.
A well-designed world should work without needing to be described, I think. The things that you don't see are the invisible things going on that, like, a well-designed world has stuff in it that you won't ever need to know about, but you would notice it if it wasn't there.
It helps you to answer questions that you ask about how should this character behave in this situation. You don't need to explicitly spell all that out, but the reader can sense patterns that these characters are behaving differently, but they're doing so in what seems to be a structured way.
I think that extends to the language as well, in that a properly constructed language will sound correct, and one that's just, like a Star Wars language, which is just random syllables with ka put after it, is not going to sound correct. It'll seem right for as long as it needs to be on the screen, but for an extended story that really has to, like a comic is a separate thing from a movie in that you linger over it and you can read it again and again and in as small parts as you want to, whereas on film you're sort of seeing the whole thing as a unit. Language in that way is something that people would really pick up on, and you would notice it if it weren't done right.
Yeah, and it works in other media too. Like Game of Thrones has many things that it does well, but one of them is that they do have some languages that feel well constructed and seem, for the most part, self-consistent. So when you hear someone say a word, you know it's Valyrian or it's Dothraki. You don't have to be told. Because it's written and you can read it, reread it, read it, and look for, what that sign in the background actually says, then there's the opportunity to dive deeper into it as you like. But even if you're not into that, again, referring to Lord of the Rings, you don't have to know what all of the words mean to recognize that there are similarities, between Gondor and Mordor. You can subconsciously recognize that there are word cells that are being reused that mean the same thing.
Hello, I'm Ewa and I make a comic called Bits Fair. And today we're gonna be talking about conlangs. And with me were two members of Spiderforest. G Pike, the creator of title Unrelated.
Hi.
And Julia Francis, the creator of the Chronicles of Oro.
Hello.
Both of you have created a conlang for your setting, but a lot of people draw stories that are set in fantasy settings, and most of them don't create an entire language, and you just kinda tend to assume that those people are speaking some sort of fantasy language, but it's never shown, and nobody ever created it, and if the writer needs some in-setting text, they can always just come up with a fantasy script and write some gibberish, or some secret message that nobody will ever bother to decode. So why did both of you decide to create an entire language for your setting?
The reason in my case is I'm a big fan of, realism, and I'm a big language nerd to start with. I've studied a lot of different languages in my life. It just felt natural to me that even though I kind of lampshaded the whole thing by having the people in the fantasy world speak English also, I just wanted it to be clear that because I have English-speaking characters coming from our world, basically, to this other world, that there would be a little bit of language barrier and cultural differences that they would have to deal with, and a lot of the story focuses on that. It just felt like the right way to handle that.
Yeah, and I like the way, even though the characters in your story, the ones who inhabit the alternate universe, they have learned English, but their culture and their language influences the way they speak English, especially the way they use pronouns and the sorts of pronouns that they use.
Yes, and that's a big point in the story, is that because their culture does not have binary gender roles, they only use one third-person pronoun for everyone, which is re. So it makes for a way to expose some cultural differences, and I just felt like it needed language to back that up.
I feel like I have a lot of similar reasons for doing this as G. First of all, the main character is English speaking and from Earth, but the rest of the characters are from this other planet. So I felt like because it's a fantasy story where most of my readers, I assume, are going to be English speakers as well, in that sense, I kind of had to keep it, these characters have to speak English for that approachability. but I really wanted to explore, again, the culture of this other world. And I felt like it would be really fun to have some sort of other language just to, have that starting block to get into the other world.
So the fantasy universe characters in your comic do speak English, because I was rereading it today and I found that there is a point where a character starts saying something in your conlang and then finishes it off in English.
Yeah, I felt like I had to have at least one type of person in this other world have their culture based around a kind of English as well, just to have that one little step forward into this other world with lots of different types of people and languages. So that was kind of just a necessity in my mind.
From my point of view as a reader, I tend to really love seeing conlangs in fantasy settings, because it just instantly makes the world just seem so much more deep and so much more rich when compared to fantasy worlds without a language of their own. Regardless of whether that's actually true or not, it just instantly seems like that, probably because language is something so fundamental to us as humans.
I totally agree.
Yes, and I feel like language and culture are not easily separable. So for me, creating a world and a culture for the people in it, even if they just spoke English, I feel that they would speak differently because, people in different parts of our world speak English differently, and that's the same for many other languages as well.
So what is the process of creating a language? Because all the tutorials that I have ever seen online tend to be all like, so you create a phonology, you create some root words, and then you create the rest of your conlang. It's kind of like that joke tutorial on how to draw an owl that you see on the internet, where you draw a circle, then you draw another circle, and then you fill in the rest of the owl. And it's not helpful as an actual tutorial. So, unsurprisingly enough, both times that I have tried to create a conlang, I created a phonology, I created some root words, and then I gave up because the rest of it was just way too overwhelming. So, what is the actual process of creating a conlang? What are the actual steps that you take?
I started kind of with the circles, so to speak. I had sort of like a cultural jump in. There were different stories and songs that these characters had as part of their culture, and I kind of just started making up sounds and words that started sounding appropriate for this culture and these characters. And I kind of built from there using those sounds and words. And in the process of coming up with different idioms and different little like flourishes, the culture kind of expanded as well. So I kind of learned a little bit about the world I was creating by creating this language as well.
I guess my method is a little different than that because having studied several languages, I should probably mention which ones. I've studied German, Mandarin, Japanese, Spanish, Latin, and little bits and pieces of a few others. And I have traveled a lot as well, so I've been in a lot of situations where I was in a place where they spoke a different language. So I was also taking some of my experiences in that area. But as far as creating the language, basically, I kind of started with the grammatical rules, I think. But actually, I think the very first thing was I had to make up some terminology for people in the world to use about certain things. For instance, they had a word for the gateway that brought the people from our world to their world. And they had a word that they sort of used almost like a slur for foreigners. So I started with a few words, and my method specifically, and this is the goofiest thing, is I'll go into like Google Translate and take an English word that I want to create an Ambayan word for and translate that into a whole bunch of different languages and then kind of get a synthesis of all of those to form a root, which I then sort of modify further, and then that becomes the word. So that's where a lot of my vocabulary roots come from. They're from real world languages. I based a lot of it in like Hindi or Turkish or or Chinese in some cases even. It's a kind of a mishmash, but ultimately it kind of I kind of struggled with like trying to make sure that it was also phonetically cohesive. I'm not sure how well I succeeded with that, but I've got a list, a spreadsheet that I have where I've written down grammatical rules and a whole bunch of vocabulary words as I create them in the story. So it's kind of, I make up words as I go whenever I need a word for something, and at this point I actually have places where I've done entire like sentences in this language. That also kind of, as it grows, also the grammar grows, and I come up with new rules that need to be added for certain situations and things like that.
Oh, so you did not create the entire language all at once?
No, it's kind of piece by piece.
I have to say I've done that too, where I've gone onto Google Translate and explored different ways of saying this English word that I know and totally used that as well. I've done that too.
What processes do you use in order to come up with grammar rules? Like, do you learn all the grammar ever and then just pull from that, or what do you do?
In the case of Ambayan, I kind of pulled a lot from various languages that I have studied. I would say that the way that verbs are formed in my conlang are a little bit like Japanese, but grammatically it's a little bit like a European language in some other ways. It's a mishmash of different things. And it's also, I intentionally made it so that it has a little bit of flexibility and ambiguity and ways to form new words from other words, so that I can start out with actually not a really large set of root words and, derive other words from those roots. And, I made up a very kind of regular way of doing pronouns and articles and things. So that's pretty regular, and most of, the spelling and grammar is pretty regular because it's kind of artificially constructed. It's also partly constructed even in the canon of the story, so I figure it wouldn't seem as weird if it doesn't quite work exactly like a naturally evolved language would.
I see, because I was reading up on conlanging and reading how conlangers deliberately add irregularities to their language in order to make it seem more naturalistic.
Yes, and I think I actually did that in a couple of cases. Like, verbs like to be usually tend to be irregular. Very common words tend to be irregular in real-world languages, so there are a few cases of that. Or cases where the spelling or letter sequence, needed to be altered in order to form a word that sounded good.
Julia, how do you come up with the grammar? Because you have a lot of your conlang in your comic. Like, when I started reading it and I saw you having translated all those speech bubbles, I was very impressed.
I haven't studied as many languages as G has. I've learned a little bit of French through education, through high school and everything. So I've kind of just based the language I've made up, the Elvish, based on what I've learned in basically French. So it's very similar to English in the, subject, object, verb, and all that stuff. I've come up with different rules for conjugating verbs that are, again, generally they follow, but yeah, words like to be are a little bit different. And besides that, I've added in a few extra little weird things. Instead of, apostrophe S for a plural, there's a word beforehand for an object and other little things like that. I've tried, again, to keep it a little bit, because the main language of the comic is English. So I've kind of tried to keep the language as, again, vague as possible, because mine's also incomplete. I do make up words as I go along as well.
Could you share some examples from your languages? Something that you have created for it that you find particularly interesting and you think the world should know about?
Well, like I said before, one of the features of mine is that they do not have gendered pronouns. Therefore, there's not even grammatical gendered noun or verb endings either. It does have a function that I haven't actually used in the comic, I think, in which for noun endings, there are suffixes to make a specific instance of something or a general instance of something. So that if you were talking about, dogs in general or, this particular dog, it would be different. But it's only like a word ending on the noun. And there's potentially an awful lot of different things you can convey contextually in a single word in terms of the verbs in this language. For instance, there's one for to have just now done something, or to often do something, or to be asked to do something. So there's a lot of, and there's, I haven't even plumbed the depth of what is possible in that schema. And it's kind of a mix of high and low information. It's mostly high information, I feel, in terms of how much you get out of individual words themselves.
I don't really have anything like that, besides little things like, just that are different from English. Adding the word la before a word to make it plural, possessive, like even if you have a possessive pronoun, you'd have to add another word in order to denote possession. If you're asking a question, you have to say a word at the end of the sentence in order to denote a question. Just little things like that.
Actually, there are 2 conlangs in my comic, although one is only used a very little bit, kind of hinted at, so far anyway. And that is, I'm trying to think of how to talk about it without, story spoilers, but there's another alien culture, and they use a different language, and they're more kind of technologically advanced. Their language is... I didn't actually make up a conlang for this one. I actually borrowed from one that's called Lojban, which is an existing conlang that's kind of neat to look into. I haven't studied enough to really have a full grasp of it yet. So the part where I used it, it was kind of like very broken and stilted. But it was like, a radio transmission or whatever, so I didn't figure that would be a big deal. I did make up an alphabet for that because I wanted it to look alien, but then I went ahead and translated it into English for the readers, obviously. And I guess I should mention that Ambayan also has an alphabet with similar numbers of characters to English, but not as many. Some of them are more like different sounds. Some of them are definitely different sounds from English. Not really any diphthongs, I don't think. But like it has a ch and k sounds in it that we don't really have as letters in English.
So, to wrap this up, do you have any resources that you could recommend to people who would like to create their own conlang?
I've used Omniglot, which is omniglot.com, because they have resources on a lot of alphabets and phrases in different languages and stuff. It's something to think about is, are you going to develop a writing system? And if so, what is it going to be? Is it going to be an alphabet, a syllabary, is it going to be hieroglyphics or, Hanzi
runes.
Or kanji?
Yeah,
or runes, or there's so many possibilities. In my case, I decided that an alphabet was simplest because I could make a font of it and then type it out whenever I need it.
As far as me, because obviously my study of language is relatively young, I found a few kind of cool things online. There's a YouTube channel called Native Lang, and they do a lot of different videos and blurbs about languages that are very different from English that I've kind of been looking up on, and I thought that might be cool for you guys to look up too.
Is Wikipedia a good one? Because I keep trying to binge read the grammar articles on there, but they're kind of boring.
Wikipedia is good for getting an overview of what's out there because of how articles are linked to each other. I've had the same problem with trying to learn things on Wikipedia, and it was a little too technically written. For instance, trying to figure out how to read, International Phonetic Alphabet, I had to go to a different site to learn that. I don't remember which site I used, or I would tell you, but I had to go somewhere else to learn that because I wasn't able to figure anything out from just reading the wiki article. There are a lot of forums out there, and I believe there's also a Twitter hashtag that are dedicated to conlang stuff.
There's also a conlanging subreddit that I visit sometimes and don't understand anything that anybody's saying about anything, but I visit it sometimes.
Oh, right. Yeah, sometimes people get a little technical about it. there's very little that's written for the layperson who just wants to do something for a story without creating an entire just language from ground up. I feel like the way that we do it for comics is often a little bit different than how your average conlang fanatic or enthusiast goes about it, which is probably, the tutorials are probably written by those sort of people who have thought about it in a much more logical and organized way than how I did it, which is, I need to make up some words, and then it went from there.
Yeah, I wish I could be as thorough as the folks who make up languages for like TVs and movies, like the full Lord of the Rings languages. I'm sure, Tolkien had a huge hand in that, but, completing it for like dialogue and film is something I wish I could do. Yeah.
Tolkien was a linguist, which is cheating.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
If you're interested in, learning about a lot of the interesting things that do make languages unique and stuff, I would recommend checking out Language Log, because that's one of the better blogs that I've ever found that talks a lot about more of the detailed stuff, but is written in a accessible way for the everyday person to read. And, as far as learning about conlangs, that's kind of I feel like most of us are still kind of just on our own floating and looking at Reddits and looking at, various websites and kind of figuring it out for ourselves.
Keeping it fun.
Yeah, I mean, and, it's fiction and it is just fun. It's not, you don't have to treat it as I'm creating the next Esperanto or something. In fact, I feel like people have made up some that are like kind of just more fun and silly, which is a great thing that we can do. Is it doesn't have to be a big undertaking. It can just be a fun exercise in, I want to try making an alphabet based on some strange schema that you don't find in the real world, or I want to make a language with some interesting trait that isn't realistic. There's just endless possibilities.
Well, unfortunately, once again, we've run out of time for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer is Christina Major, and Eva is our showrunner and our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thank you for your support, and don't forget to go to spiderforest.com and read some of the over 70 webcomics written and drawn by our members. They are all available for free. Plus, at spiderforest.com, you can join the discussion on our forums, interact with our creators, and much more. You can even click on support to make a donation. Your financial support makes our work possible, so thank you very much for your assistance. I'd like to thank our special guest for this episode, Jim Francis. You can read his comic Outsider at wellofsouls.com/outsider. I'd also like to thank Eva for bringing us this episode's discussion, as well as our members who participated, Julia Francis and G Pike. Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. Julia Francis produces the comic Chronicles of Oro. You can read it at chroniclesoforo.com. G Pike produces the comic Title Unrelated. You can read it at titleunrelated.com. And I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Mathieu Moyen. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
I've been thinking about just creating a fork of Lojban as my training wheels to make it easier for myself.
Good idea. Lojban is interesting because it was designed to, well, as the name implies, to be a logical language. It's designed so that you have very short word particles, but you convey a lot of meaning by how you combine these different... And the main problem I have with it is that there's a lot of words to memorize. Like, you have to memorize these whole lists of these grammar particles, and I just haven't gotten around to really getting into that yet.
It's nothing compared to learning an actual natural language, though. Like, when compared to learning English English, Lashban is a piece of cake.
That is true. That is true.
English has rules, but none of them follow. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yes.